Hello, my name is Sarit Katan Griffiths. I'm an associate professor of Judaism in the theology department at Fordham University and the acting director of the Center for Jewish Studies. I want to welcome all of you virtually to our community, whether you're a regular at our events or this is your first time, and to thank you for joining us today for a talk by Pratima Gopalakrishnan. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to invite you to our upcoming spring semester events. You can find more information and registration links on our blog and through our weekly newsletter. After Passover, we'll begin with a talk by New York Public Library Fordham Research Fellow Zohav Segev about the dilemma of bombing Auschwitz. Then we'll have an opportunity to learn about Jewish ceremonial art with Laura Arnold Liebman and Maya Balakirsky-Katz in an event presented in partnership with the Jewish Museum in memory of Vivian Mann. Thereafter, Michal Kravel-Tobi will be in conversation with Omri Elisha about conversion politics in Israel. Mika Ahuvia will be discussing her new book on angels and Jewish antiquity, and we'll end the semester with a panel discussion about the newly opened Pius XII archives with David Kurtzer, Chiara Rioli, Nina Volbusque, Magda Tedder, and David Gibson. I hope that you'll join us for all of these talks and panels. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce this year's third and final Selo Baron New Voices in Jewish Studies Award Lecture, which we proudly present in partnership with Columbia University's Institute for Jewish and Israel Studies. I want to thank on the Fordham side, Magda Tedder and Siobhan Verleza, and on the Columbia side, Elisheva Karlbach, Rebecca Cobran, Dana Kressel, and Dina Mann for all that they do to facilitate the program and all of our collaborative efforts in Jewish studies. Each year, we invite a number of young scholars who have recently completed their doctorates to share their research with our community as Selo Baron New Voices in Jewish Studies. Through this program, we have been able to recognize outstanding new voices in the field and to learn from a new generation of scholars about their subjects of study, methodologies, and insights. Today's speaker, Pratima Gopalakrishnan, is the Perilman Post-Doctoral Fellow at Duke University Center for Jewish Studies. Pratima received her Ph.D. from the Religious Studies Department at Yale University, where she wrote a dissertation titled Domestic Labor and Marital Obligations in the Ancient Jewish Household. A scholar of late antique Jewish religion and history, Pratima uses theoretical approaches drawn from feminist and queer theory and slavery and labor studies. She primarily works with late antique rabbinic Jewish texts, as well as the textual and material artifacts of late antique and early medieval legal cultures, and considers how ostensibly economic ancient discussions of the household, the agricultural field, but also the laboring body itself were always imbricated with the projects of defining religious, ethnic, and sexual difference. On a personal note, I want to say that I have admired Pratima's work for a long time and always learn a lot from her work and the insights she brings to conversations in the field. So it's really a pleasure to be able to introduce her to the Fordham and Columbia communities today. Pratima's talk is titled, What is Maintenance and Why Does It Matter? And it will focus on the concept of maintenance, that is food, clothing, and other provisions that are given to members of families who are labeled dependents. Pratima will explore the rich history of this term in cross-cultural perspective and discuss how studying this concept and practice as it is used in rabbinic sources teaches us about gender and labor and relationships in ancient Jewish households. During and after Pratima's talk, please submit your questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Pratima will speak for about 40 minutes, after which I'll have a chance to be in conversation with her and to ask her some of your questions. If we don't manage to ask all submitted questions, we'll be sure to share them with her after her talk. Pratima, I am honored that you're able to join us today, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from you. So thank you on behalf of Fordham and Columbia for being here today and for generously sharing your research.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Professor Katan Griffiths. Thank you to the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies for this invitation. And thank you all for being here. I'd like to begin by saying I'm so honored to be giving this lecture named for Sewell Baron, whose social historical approach to Jewish history has always been an inspiration to me. And as someone studying classical rabbinic texts, which notoriously frustrate attempts to ask social historical questions, his work has also always presented something of a challenge to me. What I'm talking about with you today is in some ways the fruit of my years-long and still ongoing engagement with that challenge. This is a talk about how the ancient household was always in the making rather than something that existed as a static bundle of obligations. I'm going to get at this question today through this strange little concept called maintenance. So here I'm going to share my screen. So feminist artists and theorists have long described care work as a form of maintenance. For instance, the artist Meryl Laderman Euclides wrote a manifesto for maintenance art in 1969, where she writes, I do a hell of a lot of washing, cleaning, cooking, renewing, supporting, preserving, etc. Also, up to now separately, I do art. Now I will simply do these maintenance everyday things and flesh them up to consciousness, exhibit them as art. I will live in the museum as I customarily do at home with my husband and baby for the duration of the exhibition and do all these things as public art activities. Euclides' manifesto thrusts the maintenance work that she does into public view by making it the subject of her exhibition. Maintenance work, cooking, cleaning, washing, supporting, preserving, is none other than the reproductive work that makes the maintenance and perpetuation of the species possible. But in this lecture, I want to discuss a different sense of the word maintenance. And I mean the use of maintenance as the routine upkeep to keep something going. So think of maintenance instead as how to look after your blender or your car. So I have here an excerpt from a blender manual. This is on how to take care of your Vitamix. Do not hit the container against any surface to free contents. Do not remove or place the container on the base while the machine is running. Do not shake or rattle the machine or container while in use. Do not place foreign objects in the container while blending. Do not overfill the container. The list of maintenance tips here is designed to maximize your use of the blender. This particular list gives you guidance solely on what not to do. Do not shake or rattle the machine while in use. Do not place foreign objects in the blender. And the one that I am most guilty of violating, do not overfill the container. These are tips for routine upkeep designed to maintain or elongate the life of your beloved household appliance. But the sense of maintenance as a form of routine upkeep is perhaps best encapsulated by the several brands of cat food that I've encountered labeled maintenance cat. Or as I like to call it, maintenance for your cat. It is the food that you give your cat to maintain its health, to participate in its upkeep, but it's also the food you give your cat in order to maintain the fiction of your cat's dependency on you once you've brought it into your house. It is this sense of maintenance that I'm most interested in for today, although all the other uses are always at the periphery of my thinking. And so I thought it was important to show you each of them. It turns out that the concept of maintenance has a distinct history as a term for the support provided to those labeled dependents. This is intentional to those labeled dependents because part of what I'm talking about today is precisely that. This is a discursive act. Labeling someone a dependent is not an inevitable conclusion. So my working definition of maintenance for today is food, clothing, or other provision given by someone in the position of provider to those considered dependents. What this support includes, variously food, clothing, lodging, etc., depends on the context, but maintenance generally refers to in-kind support. In other words, it's distinct from a cash wage. This term appears in dozens of civil law codes today, and it translates several terms from ancient corpora that are legible as law. It is a standard term in the body of literature that we might call family law. And within halachic texts or Jewish legal texts, the word often translates the term muzonot, which has its own distinct history. So this is just a brief roadmap for today. So in this talk, I'm first going to lead you through the history of the halachic term muzonot, the English term maintenance in family law, which among other things is used to translate muzonot. And then I'm going to focus on select early rabbinic Tannaitic texts from the Mishnah to show how the rabbis use maintenance in a very unusual way that sets it apart from both the later efflorescence of this term in both halachic and legal contexts. Instead, I'm going to argue that rabbinic texts give us insight into how household dependencies were always seen as in flux and in need of constant remaking. There's nothing static or inevitable about these relationships of support. They were always being negotiated. This is a case where I think the framework of family law and the seemingly kind of code adjacent nature of rabbinic texts has often led us astray. In fact, as I argue, the rabbis in these early texts have a little interest in codifying obligations as such. They use maintenance instead to explore the contours of household relationships. Or to return to the cat example, it's not that I owe my cat chicken by virtue of some codified obligation of cat mothers to cat daughters. Instead, I'm also remaking that dependency twice a day, every single time that I portion out some food for them. So let's begin with mizonot, which is a word often translated as maintenance. This is a Hebrew term from a root meaning to feed or to nourish. This term begins appearing in early rabbinic texts like the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and early Midrash. And the term usually, although not exclusively, refers to support in the form of food. The term mizonot has a long history in halacha. There's a couple of things to note in this post-rabbinic history of mizonot. First of all, mizonot becomes a term primarily associated with wives and daughters. Second, there were always questions from the medieval period onwards about what initiated these obligations and what interrupted them. And so mizonot was not only associated with wives and children, but specifically with wives whose husbands had gone overseas, widows, orphans, and so on. So in other cases, these were cases where the provision of maintenance was somehow thrown into question. So here's one example, which is from Oded Zinger's excellent work on how women's speech before courts in Geniza society followed certain cultural scripts. So this is a deed where a woman named Sit al-Kul petitions the court about her situation. And the deed reports her speech as follows. Know, O court, that my husband has tarried in Fustat and abandoned me more or less 6 or 7 years ago. He traveled without depositing maintenance with me, nor what I or his daughter may be sustained with. I am still waiting patiently. Perhaps he will return or send me and his daughter what we may be sustained with. Now the matter has become very difficult for me, and I have nothing left to be succored with. I do not know what to do. Therefore, I ask to appoint Ibrahim ibn Abu al-Khair as my proxy to go to my husband, the aforementioned Thabit ibn Shabat, to sue him for the maintenance I am owed by him from the time he left until today. So this document itself is in Judeo-Arabic, but interestingly, the word for maintenance is actually still the Hebrew mizonot, so it's al-mizonot. And this is just one example, but there are dozens of instances like this where maintenance is at the heart of a petition or the subject of a dying man's will, and so on. When I turn to the Tannaitic text, one thing I will emphasize is that the rabbis apply the discourse of maintenance to a wider range of dependents, not just wives and children, but also laborers, both enslaved and free. And the earlier rabbinic discussions of maintenance are not as focused on redress for people who are owed maintenance, although surely this is also a function of the kinds of texts we're dealing with. The other part of the story is the development of the English term maintenance. The term maintenance functions in two ways. First is that it names a contemporary concept in family law. So the term maintenance appears in the civil or family law codes of dozens of modern nation states. And second, the word is used to translate and therefore creates seemingly analogous concepts from textual corpora that are pre-modern textual corpora that are legible as law. So this includes not only rabbinic texts, but also Islamic works of fiqh and other corpora as well. So again, let's look at a few examples. So this is an example of maintenance in a contemporary family law code. This is from the Hindu Adoptions and Maintenance Act, 1956 in newly independent India. And so this discussion of maintenance begins with the definition, actually. So the definition is, maintenance includes, in all cases, provision for food, clothing, residence, education, and medical attendance and treatment. In the case of an unmarried daughter, also the reasonable expenses of an incident to her marriage. So here we see the use of maintenance to name a concept in modern family law. My example was India, but again, there are dozens of other nations that have codified maintenance in some form in their family law codes. In many, but obviously not all cases, these are countries whose legal systems draw partly on Islamic law, and so the references to maintenance are also references to an analogous Arabic concept of nafaqa. So then this leads us to the second use of maintenance, which is to translate concepts from pre-modern textual corpora. And we'll look at two examples here. The first one is from the Sasanian law book, Madayani Hazar Dadistan, and I'll just read the passage first. The following must be supported: a son until he comes of age, a daughter until she marries, a wife with full rights for life. If the maintenance can be provided from the funds of the father, this should be done from the funds of the father. But if the funds of the father are insufficient, then the funds of the son should be used. So this is from the Sasanian law book, MHD, Book of 1,000 Judgments. This is a 7th century text. The MHD is not itself a formal legal code. As far as we know, such a thing did not exist within the Zoroastrian legal system developed under the Sasanian Empire. Instead, the MHD is a compilation of legal cases and decisions. Material in the MHD is organized under a series of headings. So classical, classic family law topics like divorce or maintenance or inheritance are interspersed freely with chapters about commerce and cult. Within this compilation, chapter 28, which is what this passage is from, pertains to support of one person by another. And what I have here is an English translation from 1997, which is based on a Russian translation of the 7th century of this text, which was written in Middle Persian. So I'm pointing this out because, of course, the translation is precisely the salient point here. And the English translation of this chapter uses both the words support and maintenance to translate the Middle Persian term farishin udarishin. The subject of maintenance also appears, and this is another example of how maintenance is used to translate concepts in pre-modern textual corpora. So this concept of maintenance is also used in regards to the genre of Islamic juristic literature known as fiqh. Fiqh refers to religious knowledge derived through legal reasoning. So these scholar jurists drew on the Quran and Hadith, which are narratives about the Prophet's life, in order to weigh in on questions of daily conduct for normal people. And from the earliest centuries of classical Islam, there was a considerable output of literature in this genre. Within this corpus of juristic literature, material about nafaqa, the term usually translated as maintenance or support, appears in a number of places. And you can learn something about how these jurists organized knowledge about maintenance based on how they, where they place these discussions. So there might be a chapter devoted to maintenance within a treatise on marriage or divorce. because maintenance was considered to be associated with marital obligations. Or in some cases, an entire treatise may have been devoted to maintenance. This was the case with Kitab al-Nafaqat on maintenance, written by the 9th century Iraqi Hanafi jurist named Abu Bakr al-Khassaf. So here's a little excerpt from that. So this is from a chapter, this is, the chapter title is part of the text, a chapter regarding the slave who is married by the order of his master and what is incumbent upon him as maintenance. He said, if a slave married a freed woman by the permission of his master, and the maintenance obligation towards the wife falls on the slave, since maintenance is commensurate to use and he has the use of her, he is obligated to provide her maintenance, just as he provides her a dower. So this is a passage about how an enslaved man's marriage interrupts his ties to the enslaver. Although the man marries the freed woman by the permission of the enslaver, he himself is responsible for providing nafaqah or support to his wife. So here we see two different texts, one 7th century, one 9th century, both of them using distinct concepts, Harishin, Adarishin, Nafaqah, that are both translated as maintenance. This is what I mean when I say that when I refer to the use of maintenance to translate and therefore create analogous concepts in pre-modern corpora. And these two uses of maintenance depend on each other. So the reification of family law as something equally present in modern or ancient texts happens through the use of maintenance to name both a contemporary concept and to translate the ancient concepts. And that's why when I mentioned a little while ago that dozens of modern family law codes mention maintenance, several of these are from nation states that rely on Islamic law, in part for the vocabulary of those codes. There's this idea that there is, if not continuity, then at least shared aims or conceptual overlap between the modern codes and the ancient texts. But this is where I came up against classical rabbinic texts and found that there's something very different going on over there with mizonot, quite distinct from later halachic uses of mizonot and quite distinct from the modern discourse of maintenance. So now, having set the stage for the term maintenance, let's go back in time to the rabbinic texts. So now we're going to be looking at texts produced by groups of sages living in the province of Roman Palestine in the first 2 to 3 centuries CE. So these texts are the product of the so-called rabbinic movement. And although these texts became foundational to later Jewish interpretation, it's important to remember that at the time and place where they were written, none of this was inevitable. So I'm talking about this group of texts called Tannaitic texts. You don't have to remember that word. I'll just say early rabbinic texts, but I'm talking about texts produced in this region during the 2nd through 4th century CE. It includes texts like the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and certain early works of Midrash. So, like I said, at this time period that we're discussing, the rabbis had not yet ascended to their full, to their full powers and their full fame. So at this point, they're just groups of men with very wide-ranging interests, possibly quite diverse backgrounds, who use their collective study and writing to elevate the everyday into literature that's quite unlike anything else being produced at this time. And I found reading these texts that while these early rabbinic texts talk a lot about mizonot, they're not interested in using this term to codify obligations for family members. I note this because between the later halachic use of mizonot and the emergence of maintenance as a modern concept, that's often how these texts have been read. There's a tendency to read rabbinic texts in order to establish whether a certain category of dependent received maintenance or not. Today, I'm actually going to be focusing on texts from the Mishnah because that is the text most often given to this kind of reading, perhaps because it has this strange, it's kind of sui generis, it has this kind of code adjacent looking form. Now, while the Sasanian and Islamic texts that I showed you both organize chapters or treatises under, Harishin, Adarshin, Nafaqah, respectively, there's no tractate or treatise on mizonot in early rabbinic texts. So I'm going to show you 4 representative texts now to think through what mizonot does for the rabbis, and these 4 texts come from 4 very different tractates. And I'm going to make three main points. First is that the rabbis apply the discourse of maintenance to a much wider range of dependents, not just wives and children, but also enslaved and free laborers. Second, I'm going to talk about how the Mishnah uses maintenance to define dependencies in relation to one another. And third, I'm going to talk about how the Mishnah does not display a uniform interest in codification. In other words, they're not interested in producing a consistent or coherent portrait of someone's personal status in the household. So let's start with the first one. So, like I said, the rabbis from the medieval period onwards, the term mezonot is most often associated with wives and widows, children and orphans. But in rabbinic texts, it's also associated with laborers and enslaved persons. So I'm going to read this passage, which is from Mishnah Bava Metzia 7:1. This is a chapter that's all about hired laborers. It says, if a man hired workers in a place where it was the custom to maintain them, he should maintain them. Or if in a place where it was the custom to provide them sweet food, he must do so. It once happened with Rabbi Yochanan ben Mattia that he said to his son, go and hire workers for us. And the son stipulated to the workers that he would provide them maintenance. When he came back to his father said to him, even if you prepared a feast like that of Solomon, we would not have fulfilled our obligation towards them, because they are the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Rather, before they start their work, go and say to them, work for me on the condition that you will have only bread and lentils. This is a passage that exemplifies the definition of maintenance as something distinct from a cash wage. If the wage is given in exchange for the work done, what then is the purpose of providing maintenance? To use a modern parallel, there are wages and then there are perks. If a tech company provides a wage in exchange for the work done, then what is the purpose of providing a ping pong table or free beer on tap in a company common area? What other claims is the employer making in that case on the employee? In the case of the Mishnah, what does the offer of maintenance purchase that a wage does not? My second point is about how the Mishnah uses maintenance to define dependencies in relation to one another. So here I'm going to look at Mishnah Ketubot 4:4. So I'm going to read it first. A father has authority over his daughter in regards to her betrothal by money, by writ, or by intercourse. And he has authority over her fines, her work, and the nullification of her vows. He receives her get, but he does not enjoy the usufruct from her property during her life. If she is married, her husband exceeds the father in that he may enjoy the usufruct of his wife's property during her lifetime, but he is obligated to provide for her maintenance, ransom, and burial. This Mishnah has generally been interpreted as establishing a maintenance claim for wives and the absence thereof for daughters. A lot has been made of this alleged codification. So on the one hand, the maintenance right for wives and the use of rights language is deliberate on my part here. The maintenance right for wives is celebrated. And on the other hand, the absence of such a claim for daughters is read as a sign of the rabbis' parochialism on this subject compared to their Greco-Roman counterparts. In any case, the absence of a claim for daughters is often treated as a problem that needs explaining. But this interpretation misses how this Mishnah constructs patriarchal authority itself as expressible in terms of entitlements and obligations. The rabbis create difference between wives and daughters by making them comparable in terms of their claim to maintenance, to ransom, burial, their control over their work, and so on. The extent and limits of parental authority defined in the first part of the Mishnah only make sense when we then get to the discussion of the wife in the second part of the Mishnah. So the fact that a father does not control the usufruct of his daughter's property is salient only because we then learn that a husband does control the usufruct of his wife's property. The fact that a husband controls the usufruct of his wife's property is salient only because we learn he provides for her maintenance, ransom, and burial, and because of the inference that a father does not provide these things for his daughter. Through this delineation of authority as measured by these barometers of control and obligation, the Mishnah achieves this comparison of the wife and daughter as two categories of dependence. My third point about the Mishnah's use of mezonot is that the Mishnah does not display a uniform interest in codification. I define codification here as an attempt to render consistent and coherent portraits of someone's personal status in the household. So here I'm going to show you two Mishnah texts about maintenance for enslaved persons. First up is this passage, Mishnah Gittin 1:6, that uses maintenance to compare divorce to manumission. So I'm gonna read it first. If a man says, "Give this writ of divorce to my wife," or this document of manumission to my slave, if he wanted to take back both of them, he may. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. The sages said he may take back the writs of divorce, but not the slave's writs of manumission, because one may confer benefits on a person in their absence, but one may only confer detriment on a person in their presence. For if a man chose not to maintain his slave, this is permitted, but if he does not wish to maintain his wife, this is not permitted. Okay, what's going on here? This Mishnah compares divorcing a wife to manumitting an enslaved man. The question is, if a man divorces his wife or manumits an enslaved man, can he then change his mind? And for the sages and for Rabbi Meir, the answer depends on whether divorce and manumission are considered benefits or not. So both of them agree that divorce is a bad thing. It's okay to renege on a decision to divorce because you would be doing something beneficial for the wife. But they disagree about a manumission. The sages say a manumission is a benefit, and Rabbi Meir says it's a detriment. The sages say that manumission is a benefit for the enslaved man, and so the manumitter can't take back his decision and end up doing something detrimental to the enslaved man. Rabbi Meir says, no. Manumission is a detriment too, just like divorce. So why is that? Why would Rabbi Meir consider manumission a detriment? The editorial voice of the Mishnah, so this part in bold, says that it has to do with maintenance. A man may choose not to maintain an enslaved man in his household, but he must maintain his wife. So the Mishnah says, the sages think that manumission is a benefit because the enslaved man was not entitled to maintenance anyway, so he's not losing anything by being manumitted. And through this, and they're implying here that, they're either implying that Rabbi Meir did think that he was entitled to maintenance, or it's unclear. They don't say what the Rabbi Meir part of that is. But the point is, through this third little sentence, the Mishnah massages this discussion of manumission and divorce, and they construct the difference between wives and enslaved men as having to do with maintenance. If we were to treat this text as an artifact of family law, then the main takeaway here would be, okay, wives get maintenance, enslaved men don't, got it, like why does it have to be so complicated? But actually, that's where it's not so simple, because there is another passage, Mishnah Yevamot 7:1, which also discusses maintenance for enslaved persons and ends up saying something quite different. So that passage says, if a widow who marries a high priest brings him malog and tzon barzel slaves, the malog slaves do not eat the truma, which is the restricted agricultural produce, but tzon barzel slaves do eat the truma. These are malog slaves. If they die, their death is her loss. If their value increases, it is her gain. Even though he, the husband, is obligated for their maintenance, they do not consume truma. And these are the tzon barzel slaves. If they die, their death is his loss. If their value increases, it is his gain, since he is obligated to provide compensation in case of their loss, i.e., in case of their loss, the husband must repay the wife the value of them. Therefore, tzon barzel slaves consume truma. Okay, so what's happening here? This passage describes a high priest marrying a widow. In such a marriage, just contrary to the halakha, the wife herself is ineligible to eat the truma, which is the restricted agricultural produce that is the priestly portion. But the Mishnah asks, what about the enslaved persons the wife brings as part of her dowry? Can they eat this restricted produce? And the Mishnah answers this question by defining two kinds of dodal property, or dodal property means property that's in a dowry. So the two kinds of dodal property are tzon barzel and malog. Tzon barzel is dodal property that effectively belongs to the husband because he is responsible for any appreciation or depreciation in its value. Malog property is dodal property that effectively belongs to the wife because she is responsible for any appreciation or depreciation in its value. This also means that if Tzon Barzel property were to be destroyed, the husband is responsible for repaying the value of that property to the wife. If Milog property is destroyed, on the other hand, the cost of that is absorbed by the wife herself. This passage has been appreciated for its twofold definition of dodal property and the attendant implications for women as property owners. But this emphasis on women's rights as property owners misses the fact that Mishnah Yevamot makes this very deliberate and strange choice to define dodal property using enslaved persons as its paradigmatic example. I'd like to note what a fraught choice this is. They have chosen the contradiction in terms that is human chattel in order to differentiate classes of dodal property. This is not an accidental choice. And because of this discursive choice of enslaved persons, the distinction between Tzon Barzel and Milog then has implications for whether different classes of enslaved persons are entitled to maintenance or not. The Mishnah says that although enslaved persons who are labeled Milog receive maintenance from the husband, they do not eat the truma. The statement is implying that truma is similar to maintenance. If these people receive maintenance, then the Mishnah says, it requires clarifying that, actually they cannot have truma. And then the Mishnah says, since husbands are responsible for compensating the value of destroyed Tzon Barzel property, these enslaved people can consume the truma. So here the Mishnah suggests that Tzon Barzel, like the enslaved Tzon Barzel person's eligibility for truma flows from the fact that the husband is responsible for repaying the wife if they die. But there is no mention of maintenance for the second category of enslaved persons. So how does maintenance function in this Mishnah? There's a clear mention of maintenance for an enslaved Milog person, but what about maintenance for an enslaved Tzon Barzel person? There is a temptation here to assume that if a person classified as Milog property received maintenance, then all the more so must a person classified as Tzon Barzel. This is a kind of a fortiori argument. Alternatively, one might say, well, if the rabbis didn't mention maintenance for the Tzon Barzel category, then these people did not receive maintenance. This is a kind of codification fallacy. It's the assumption that if there was no statement on a particular obligation, then the obligation did not exist. I'd like to refuse both these explanations and offer a different account. The presence or absence of a maintenance obligation is not a barometer for testing how the rabbis felt about this or that class of dependent. Instead, maintenance is a discursive technique for defining two particular dependencies. In this case, the placing of persons into relationships of enslavement. Maintenance interacts with truma in the case of the person classified as Milog, but it is not mentioned at all in the case of the person labeled Tzon Barzel. Maintenance is irrelevant in the case of the enslaved Milog person because the husband has use of that person. This does not mean that the former was entitled to maintenance and the latter wasn't, nor does it mean that the rabbis were more favorably disposed to one category of enslaved persons than another. The Mishnah does not understand maintenance as an aspect of personal status. Rather, it is simply, maintenance is simply one axis along which a relationship of dependency is constructed. And of course, this Mishnah also shows quite plainly that there is no pan-Mishnaic attempt to codify maintenance obligations for different classes of dependents. So it's not so simple as to say wives get maintenance, enslaved persons don't. So to recap so far, we began with the history of mazonot and maintenance. I talked about the long halakhic history of mazonot, its emphasis on wives and children as recipients of maintenance. I also talked about the efflorescence of maintenance as a modern legal concept, how it refers to both a contemporary concept in family law and also translates concepts from ancient textual corpora. Then I turned to classical rabbinic texts, which are much earlier than any of these other sources I discussed, and I argue that there's something different going on in these texts. These texts are often read as artifacts of family law in light of this later development of mazonot and maintenance. These texts are read as codifying a personal status, but in fact, they're doing something else. These texts are interested in maintenance not because of the interest in codifying obligations, but because maintenance is a tool for constructing different kinds of dependencies. These texts give us insight into household dependencies as something that require maintenance to keep going in several senses of the word. They open a world into the negotiation of household relationships as an ongoing, never complete process, rather than as something that is concluded with the fact of a code. I'd like to conclude by returning to the maintenance blender and the maintenance cat and the maintenance manifesto. The blender manual wants to teach you how to maximize use of your household appliance. The maintenance cat food will help you maintain your healthy, moderately active adult cat's health and current weight. Does the cat depend on you? I'd like to ask this question very seriously. Surely the cat depends on you, you might think. How else would it survive and be healthy? 8 years ago and 4 years ago, I brought a cat home with me, and twice a day, every day, I reenact their dependency on me through the drama and ritual of mealtime as they serenade me from outside the room where I portion out their food. To actually let them into the room as I portion out the food would be chaos. Every now and then I wonder what their lives would have been like if they had lived them outdoors. They would have been shorter lives perhaps, and they would have caused more decimation to the local bird ecosystem. On the whole, I think this is better. And then I open the door with 2 bowls of food in hand. What about the blender? Does the blender depend on you? This is a tougher question to think about, perhaps. We might think that the blender exists and was invented solely for our use. The blender serves a much more clearly instrumental purpose. And when you use it, you may stop and think, as I do, about the manual kitchen labor it has replaced and feel grateful for it. Okay, but then do cats receive their maintenance because of their usefulness to you? Mine don't, not really. I couldn't live without them, but they're not exactly useful to my work. One of the legacies of maintenance as a legal concept is that it's made it a little too easy to think of it in terms of the rights of an indigent person, someone who needs support because they couldn't survive without it, because they're a good and deserving recipient of support in the eyes of society. But once we set aside this framework of law and rights, we see a completely different conversation going on in rabbinic texts about maintenance as a malleable concept for defining relationships rather than the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I learned a ton. And your introduction and your conclusion about the cats reminds me of a book that I recently read with my second grader called The Grand Escape. I don't know if you've read it, but it's by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor. And it's about 2 cats, Margot and Polo, who have a very loving family and who receive dinner every night and are so curious to know what happens outside and what life would be like on their own. And they actually like escape. And the whole book is about how they're going to find food. And it's very pertinent actually, because they have for themselves this moral discussion. Would it have been better to stay home and be dependent on humans, but to have delicious food every night at the same time? Or is the like drama of dumpster diving and like the politics of street cats more fitting for them, even though they sometimes go hungry? And it's like the whole book is about that dilemma. So I'm just putting that out there as a recommendation, but also really you use the cat example in such a powerful way, I think, at the end to really show us how what rabbinic sources are doing or what they're interested in is sort of figuring out the relationships between different people and the dependencies on one another, rather than articulating what someone deserves either to give or to receive, and showing that maintenance itself is like what creates relationships and what creates what we call the household, which I thought was really a powerful way of reframing it. I want to start just with 2 questions, and I want to encourage everyone to submit questions in the Q&A box. The first question is, I really appreciated how you showed us, first of all, how maintenance is a contemporary concept and also a contemporary legal concept, but also how it comes up in Islamic law, in Sasanian law, in documents from the Cairo Geniza. And so I was thinking about what are the sources for maintenance that either predate rabbinic sources or that are contemporary to rabbinic sources? Like, in what world were the rabbis, the Tannaitic rabbis, thinking of mizonot, of maintenance? Or is this a concept that they are sort of naming and articulating in a way that then gets much more popular thereafter?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that, and I'll have to look up this Grand Escape book. It sounds perfect. There's also a long series for anyone interested in the cat parts of this talk. There's a long series of these two cats, Fitz and William, I think, or who live in Cambridge and go on these adventures, and it's great for thinking about maintenance. But okay, the question of maintenance as are the rabbis naming, would I go earlier to tell the story? I think essentially, or are they doing something new? I tend to think they are naming something new. Whenever I try to find antecedents for this concept, I look to places like Roman legal discussions of the relationship between dowry and support. That would be one place to look. I've also looked at agricultural manuals because they talk in interesting ways about, and these are just artifacts of violence of Roman agricultural slavery, but they talk about what must be provided to the enslaved persons as kind of tools of estate farming. So I think those are two of the kind of antecedents that I've looked at. I'm always open to hearing about others, I should say. But I do think that the rabbis are doing something new here, and part of what they're doing that's new is this connection of maintenance to work. I think that's kind of the glue that starts to hold some of this all together. What they don't do, of course, is put all of this in something called Masechet Mizonot. I think that's an equally kind of interesting move that they do not take that some later corpora do.
That's fascinating. So they're creating this new way of thinking about support and relationships in the household, but they're not yet codifying it, which is what ends up happening in the medieval period. So this actually leads perfectly to my second question, which is about the distinction between maintenance and wage, and how you see that difference, and sort of the practical aspect of it. And I'll just say that one of the things I was thinking about is wage being so dependent on time often, and maintenance on status or something like that. And also just thinking about debates in tax laws and tax codes about stipends and are stipends taxed or not, and sort of the distinction between like a wage versus a stipend, as actually being really practical in a very contemporary context, also in the work of academia.
Yes, I think every graduate worker will see themselves in discussions of maintenance and will intensely feel this kind of definitional, will relate to this experience of posing a definitional problem. Are you receiving a wage? Are you a worker? And all the ways that universities either avoid or obfuscate that question. So this question, okay, so a fantastic text that I did not include today is from the Tosefta Baba Metzia, and it's about it actually answers the question of, okay, so what does maintenance purchase that a wage doesn't? And the answer is so it's about, if you hire someone and pay them maintenance, then they cannot hire themselves out at night they can't do their own work at night. Or if you hire someone's animal and provide the animal maintenance or something, then then that person can't hire out the animal at night or to somebody else, or make the animal do some work for them. So in that case, what maintenance purchases is this kind of, it's kind of a claim to that person's, it's a claim to that person's body, like that extends beyond the wage contract or the wage relationship itself. So that's one of the ways that I'm thinking about what does maintenance purchase that a wage doesn't. The other fantastic passage that I didn't include today is from Mishnah Ketubot 5, 8, or 9. It's this passage that talks about that never uses the word mizonot, actually, and that's partly why I hesitate to use it. But talks about here is if a man is supporting his wife through an agent, then he provides her the following, this much wheat, this much oil, this much grain, whatever. And then it says, he gives her, it connects her textile work to a silver coin, basically. And the silver coin is often treated, I think, a little condescendingly in scholarship, sometimes as a kind of as pocket money or as a kind of little allowance. So that's another case where that passage is interesting, both because it's perhaps an instance of a if we would call that maintenance, and I'm not sure if we will, then maybe it's an example of a cash transaction that makes a claim to somebody's work. So those are the two passages that I'm thinking of when you ask that.
Thank you so much. So I have, so first of all, we have many questions, and also people who are writing saying that this is fantastic. So you should know that. I have two related questions that came in about maintenance. The first is about why you decide to translate the term mizonot at all rather than using mizonot. Like what benefit does it have to use the word maintenance, and what would you gain just by calling it mizonot on the one hand? And then a second question about the legal use of the term maintenance, which you've shown is defined as support that a dependent woman and or laborer gets from the master, husband, or caretaker, and why how you use that term in relation to Euclid's use of maintenance as work that women are expected to perform in order to maintain a household. So sort of the slippage or the distinction between the two.
Wow, these are both fantastic questions. Thank you so much. So the question of why bother translating maintenance or mizonot at all, I think, there is an open question of how to, when every time I talk about this or write about it, obviously there's a question of when to leave it untranslated or not. But I think when it came to actually presenting the material for today, it was a no-brainer that I had to explain. I mean, part of the fun of this topic is that it has this ridiculously rich history precisely because of these slippages in translation. So I'm not mad about some of these how some of these translations panned out, because it kind of following the breadcrumb trail of the translation helps you see how something as huge as family law becomes a category that exists across time. And that's I think that's why it's been valuable to kind of go through the exercise of telling that story. But then that's why it's also been helpful to differentiate between the history of mizonot, which is a distinct story, from the history of maintenance and its emergence as a modern concept.
Thank you.
And the second question about, so what is the relationship between, this is something I'm still thinking through. I think I'll just say for now that this is partly me, putting these kind of hearing these two conversations happening in two different worlds, and this is my way of kind of putting them together, so that's part of it. Maintenance is a term that will be familiar to Marxist feminist theorists, I think. And maintenance at the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies might mean something very different. And I think that in itself is a productive tension. And that's why it's been, I actually think both, I would like for Meryl Lederman Euclides to learn about this other use of maintenance too, just as much as I'd like, folks who study ancient Judaism to learn about the maintenance work definition of maintenance. So I don't have a pat answer to that question, but yeah, I think it is a kind of productive tension between these two uses of the word.
Yeah, and I actually think that they're more related than you're giving credit to the relationship even, because it's about, in Euclides' work, it's about either women or also maintenance workers in some of her work too, that maintain the household or the city. And in the rabbinic sources, it's the head of the household, so usually a man who is maintaining a woman, and so or an enslaved person, and so actually it's sort of a flip of who has sort of the agency or the power in that relationship. So when you're thinking about relation building through the concept of maintenance, what Euclides is doing is like flipping it and saying, like, our city runs or our family runs on the maintenance work of these people rather than the other way around. So it's actually a really subversive message in a way. I have three questions that we're going to go through in more specific and then branching out all that were submitted through the Q&A. The first is about the why question. Why did rabbis use maintenance as a tool of defining relationships rather than codifying maintenance or focusing on maintenance as a right? Sort of, do you have ideas for why their focus was on the relationships themselves?
The simple answer is no. I don't know why they did it, but I think it has to do with, well, first of all, I think the insight that these texts, which have long been legible as law, are in fact, maybe not best read as legal artifacts, is a pretty commonplace one among scholars of rabbinic texts. But I've noticed that there's a certain habit when it comes to questions of gender or the household to kind of fall back on this habit of reading these texts as if they were still, coherent legal artifacts. So that's why the move is important to me, to point out that that's not what they're doing. As for why the rabbis didn't do it, I don't know why they didn't do it with this in particular, but it feels of a piece with what's happening in these texts in general, that they're not. In other words, what I'm saying here is following from a broader insight in this field about how to resist reading these texts as legal artifacts.
The next question is asking you to say more about the category of family, as in family law, and how it's operating in relation to the category of maintenance, particularly as its boundaries have been used and reproduced by scholars when we talk about dependency, labor, and obligation. So put differently, what can turning to rabbinic sources on the question of maintenance reconfigure our thinking on family as a social and political category?
Another fabulous question that I'm going to think out loud a little bit about this. So I think the emergence of family law, and this is something that scholars of colonial law have been writing about for a long time, is that this is the category of family law itself is the result of this Orientalist project of codifying and translating texts that look like law, especially, and so when this is happening in British India, especially in the case of Islamic texts, Hindu texts that are rendered as codes. So the point of creating this category of family law in this colonial context is to then make it possible for the colonial state to then take over the administration of law in those kind of give it both creates family law as a realm where legal pluralism is recognized. So there's a recognition that there are different regimes of family law, that the Jews and the Parsis and the Muslims and the Christians, they may have their separate codes, but this is a way of marking that difference. And so that's why family law becomes the prominent way of defining religious difference in terms of gender and in terms of personal status. So I think that's partly why I am cautious to extremely suspicious of the use of this term as applied to rabbinic texts, because it has this origin in this very particular context. I'm not sure how much it really helps us when we're looking at ancient texts. And I think it does absolutely retroject this idea of family as a group of individuals with differential status who have different kinds of property rights and claims on one another. It kind of unhelpfully retrojects that onto ancient sources.
Thank you. That was really interesting. The next question is even broader, which is about how do you understand and perhaps push back on some of the key feminist theoretical interventions on care labor, for example, household as paid and not within the family, and the outsourcing of labor to non-familial individuals. And I guess I would say, and how it's tied actually really interestingly in rabbinic sources that you showed us of mizonot applying not only to wives and daughters, but also laborers and enslaved people.
Yes, I think, thank you for the question. I think rabbinic texts, the examples that I showed today, I think one thing that they will kind of put front and center is that the pairing of free and enslaved labor when it comes to these questions. They're always thinking about free and enslaved people together when they're having these discussions about what we would call care work or domestic labor or whatever we want to call it. So I think that's one of the, I'm deeply indebted to these theoretical interventions, and I see myself very much working in that context. But I think that's one of the things that you just can't escape when you're working with the rabbinic texts. The other, I'm reminded of a passage from the Mishnah about from Mishnah about 5:5 about the tasks that a wife owes her husband. It's a list of 7 tasks, and then it says, if she has 1 enslaved woman as part of her dowry, she doesn't have to do, the cooking. She has 2, she doesn't have to do the breastfeeding. She doesn't have, if she has 3, then, she doesn't have to do the cleaning, whatever. And one of the implications, I hope, of, resisting the urge to read these as codifications or as legal artifacts, one of the implications of that, I hope, is that we can look at texts like that and not and kind of not reproduce the text logic that a woman, that the free woman's freedom is purchased through enslaving more and more women. I hope that one of the I hope that we're able to resist kind of repeating those logics in our own scholarship. So that's another thing that I'm thinking about in relation to this question.
Thank you. One question that is asked is about what you think about the implication of providing maintenance in addition to wages. So not necessarily only in contrast to, but also in addition, and how does maintenance function in that context?
So I think here I would refer back to that passage that I mentioned earlier. That I think the implications of the two passages, the one from the Tosefta about if you provide maintenance to a hired laborer, then you can't. You're basically purchasing use of his body. And I think use is the other word that I threw in here that I'm thinking about. Is that I think the implications of providing maintenance in addition to a wage is that it does let you make certain claims to use of somebody else.
And maybe as our time runs out, I have three more questions. The first is about if the person asking the question is remembering correctly, Mark Cohen wrote that the term for the communal charity institution in the Geniza period was mizonot and not kupa or tamhui. And there's curiosity about, have you found any connection between mizonot and charity? And what is the difference or the relationship?
Thank you for noting that. So I haven't found any connection between mizonot and charity in rabbinic texts, but that this actually fits with my picture of mizonot in Geniza society or in the medieval period as it does become more tied to charity, and it does become more tied to it becomes more tied to when I said cases where the obligation is interrupted. So wives whose husbands went overseas, widows, orphans, all these people who are constructed as indigent and therefore deserving of support in the form of communal charity. So thank you for noting this. Like I said, I specifically don't see that in the earlier rabbinic text, but this is fascinating to know about the Geniza period.
And I thought we would end on returning to rabbinic sources. And so I have two questions, which you can feel free to answer one or both of them. The first is, I'm curious, most of the sources, maybe even all of them that you shared with us, are halachic sources that are focused on like what people should do and so on. And I'm curious to know if there are agadot, stories, that include mizonot. If there are, then I would love to hear like your favorite story or a story that is remarkable in some way. If not, or if there are not so many, I'm curious also to know about why that might be the case when there are so many stories about various aspects of rabbinic law. And then coupled with that, I would love to hear what you found sort of in a word in the Amoraic texts. Sort of how does mizonot change between the Tannaitic period, which you shared with us so beautifully, and then with the Sasanian law book and Fifth and the Geniza, sort of in that in between space. Can you give us like the sneak peek into your discoveries on that?
Oh boy. I can start with the first one. I think I'm pulling up my notes from the time that I read every text about mizonot a long time ago. Yeah, I think my favorite. Okay, I should start by saying I haven't found like a ton of agadic sources about maintenance, and it is interesting to think about why that is. But there is one that immediately struck me. It's from Genesis Rabbah 2:2, and it's about it's a mashal. It's a parable about a king who bought two enslaved men. Both of them on one bill of sale for the same price. It says the first one would be cared for at public expense, and the second one would be ordered to work hard for his food. And so the second one is shocked and confused, and he said, we were both on the same bill of sale for the same price. How can it be that this one is supported at public expense, and if I don't work hard, then I don't eat? So that is a good example, I think, of both how the rabbis kind of, it's a good encapsulation of how the rabbis connect maintenance to work much more strongly than I think anyone before or after does. But like I said, it is still interesting, and I'm going to think about why it is that I haven't found a ton of great Ungadic sources about this. And what was the second question? Oh, in a word, the Amharic sources. I think the Amharic sources, I'm thinking of Bavli Gittin, which has a Bavli Gittin 11b to 13a, I think, and Bavli Gittin 58b, maybe something like that. One thing that I remember being really striking from those sources, which I think actually someone mentioned in the Q&A as well, is this formula of Eini Nizonet ve'eini osa, like, again, that connection between work and maintenance, and this formula, and I will have to forgive me, I do not remember what I thought about this, but I remember being really struck by this formula and how it keeps reappearing, and the use of the connection between someone's claim to maintenance and the rabbi's evaluation of their productive potential, and how these kinds of vows of, I hereby forego my maintenance obligation figure into that. And of course, those become hugely important from the medieval period onwards, because they find their way into variable ketubah stipulations, so on and so forth. This enduring connection between a wife's right to maintenance and her control over her work turns out to have a very long history after, like in the post-Talmudic period. So that's what I'll say about that now.
Oh, thank you so much. So for me, one of the things that I'm taking away from this talk is that what you've shown us, or what you've shown me, I should say, is how much we take for granted, or I take for granted, about relationships, even something as simple as having dependents, and what that means, and sort of rethinking what those relationships do, how those relationships are maintained, and using rabbinic sources to really shed light on the way that we ourselves sort of configure ourselves in households and in societies and so on. But then also, and I think what you do so beautifully is also show how the whole construct of maintenance in all of these different realms also helps us to see what's unique and interesting and different about rabbinic sources. I want to thank you so much for sharing your work. This was really wonderful and a lot of fun, and also really insightful. And so I want to, on behalf of Fordham and Columbia, congratulate you again, and to say that we are all eager to see your work develop, and to continue reading it and learning from you. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and to say that I hope you will join us for upcoming lectures and panels. And we value your being here, Pratima, and also everybody else. And we wish you a good night.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful, such a wonderful experience. Wonderful questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.